Welcome back. You're hanging in there. We're getting through it. We're almost done. We are now going to look at the scoring for Rubric 5. And Rubric 5 is all about monitoring your students through assessment and supporting their learning in your modified assessments. So the question for this is, how are the formal and informal assessments selected or designed to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy to comprehend and the related skills? So we're going to look at unpacking Rubric 5. Before we do that, let's take a look at this question. So Rubric 5 has its very own question on the commentary paper. It is question 5, and there are only 2 parts. It is the shortest question, so it will be the quickest one to go over. So it asks, in response to the prompts, refer to the assessments that you will submit as part of your planning task. So we're looking at your assessments here for this, that exit ticket, that rubric, and anything else that you have designed that will assess your students. So for the first prompt, prompt A, it says, describe how your planned formal and informal assessments will provide direct evidence, that is key, that students can use the essential literacy strategy to comprehend, you don't have to worry about compose, and your related skills throughout the learning segment. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack. There are lots of edTPA coded language. Here's how you can structure this response to do really well. Start by explaining what your planned formal and informal assessments are and state that they will provide direct evidence because how? So on the first day, students are informally assessed, and here's where you're going to explain your exit ticket. Through a short exit ticket, by informally assessing their understanding after the modeling, I'm able to recognize who needs more support in understanding the skills and strategy I just taught. Any student who needs more support will be shown by the direct evidence of mastery and understanding the strategy of synthesize by getting a 75 on the quiz. The direct evidence that you're collecting that will show you that your students understand the strategy of synthesize is a 75 on the quiz. Those who don't, you've got to take it a step further. Then what are you going to do? Those who don't get that 75 will be asked to join me at the table during guided practice in locating key details, combining new details with their previous knowledge, and synthesizing those related skills, how their perspective changed. These skills build upon each other, and the quiz provides a quick method to assess which students need more support before independently applying the skill. Okay, so that's day 1. Checking in to see that they got the strategy, they understand it. The planned formal assessment is a teacher-made rubric that directly aligns to the learning objectives. You could even say to the standards too. Each of the criteria represents a skill, a related skill that leads to the mastery of the strategy synthesizing. Students will be asked questions posed by the teacher at the start of each lesson, which they will answer first by just using their background knowledge, so the what I know part. Then they're going to read the new excerpt from the text, locate key details. After they're reading, they're going to use those key details to answer their original question again from what they've read, and they'll be required to write a new paragraph independently, and the scoring rubric will be used to assess their paragraphs and synthesize how their perspective changed. So that's a description of the formal assessment. So we see in the informal assessments up here, the formal assessments here, and now we need the direct evidence. The direct evidence the rubric will provide is mastery of the essential literacy strategy of synthesizing with a score for their paragraphs written by the students. They have to earn at least a 2 in each category. There are 4 categories of the rubric, and then they all get described, and each one aligns to a related skill. The 4th category is mechanics, which was taught in previous units. You are welcome to do that. If you want to put writing mechanics in, just say that it came from a previous unit. And it's expected that 5th graders can write with proper mechanics. Each criteria will be scored from 1 to 3. With mastery being a level 2 and with the expectations at each level clearly described in the rubric boxes, a student who doesn't get a 2 out of possible 3 is pulled into a small group during what I need time. If your school has the win period, you can talk about that as a place to help them. This kind of data-driven instruction will give me direct evidence that they've mastered the skill. It will also help me to target specific areas that I might need to reteach if many students don't earn that 3. The formal rubric is also being used informally during lesson 2 to score the students' paragraphs, this low stakes use of the rubric. So talking about that day 2 use of the rubric in a more informal way gives them a chance to practice being scored. Assessment is a key component of this learning segment. It's used in all 3. So things that are done really well, got a good informal assessment, got a good formal assessment, it's being used informally in day 2, those are great things. Some areas that aren't necessarily the strongest in this, I see good assessment of the related skills, not necessarily an awesome description of how synthesizing is actually getting assessed. I know what's happening, they're writing that paragraph, but I would pull out more on how that rubric is being used to assess their actual application of the strategy being taught. I feel like there's more focus on these skills here, and I don't necessarily see, like, the rubric doesn't explicitly assess them in synthesizing. So if it were me, I would have used that 4th category to say student can synthesize. That to me is what's missing in this. Okay, letter B is explain how the design or the adaptation of your assessments, not your supports, not how you're adapting your teaching. This is very specifically asking how are you adapting your assessment to allow students with specific needs to demonstrate their learning. This is one of the questions where you have to talk about your IEPs and your 504s, your English language learners, your struggling readers. You have to talk about them. If you don't, you get an automatic 1. And remember, this is just your assessments. Do not write about the ways that you are modifying your teaching for these students, just your assessments. If you haven't modified your assessments, that's a thing you need to do. If you have nothing to talk about, you need to do something so you have something to talk about. Okay, so the informal short quiz allows me to quickly check in with students in a low stakes way. If they get a grade lower than 75%, I'm going to use this to pull them back into a group. So that's just a reminder of the informal assessment. The quiz can be altered for my students with IEPs and those who read below grade level by reading it out loud to them. So there's a very quick and easy way to modify that first assessment. The formal scoring rubric assessment will provide me with more detailed information about their ability to do the strategy, and the formal rubric will be modified for students who have IEPs by requiring fewer key details that they need within the text, 1 instead of 2, and removing the writing mechanics row for those students with writing supports in their IEPs. These students will get to use a word processor. So that is directly related to the IEP goals in this class. And you can see the modified rubric is not just talked about, it's actually in the assessment materials. So we can see it's kind of a weak informal modification. It is a weak one because it's just that it's going to be read aloud. What else might you do for these students to modify this rubric or this exit ticket? But the modified rubric is excellent. And if that's not enough, there's also this checklist that's used. Additionally, a checklist for writing their paragraphs will be provided for those who have difficulty turning a rubric into actionable items. A checklist can make the writing more procedural and clear. Excellent. Another modification is allowing students who have trouble physically writing to dictate. That's part of their IEP goals. All students in the class will get immediate corrective feedback. That's just good. Constant evaluation. Together, these strategies will make meaningful assessments of student learning that support them, but also challenge them to grade level expectations. Really good modifications of assessments going on here for the rubric, for the writing activity, find modifications that meet the IEPs for the informal assessment. Let's take a look at the rubric. So key concepts, you got to know what informal and formal assessments are, and that's explained. That's the definition we've been using in this class. It's based on the edTPA, so I'm not going to go over that. Auto criteria, if you don't modify your assessments for your students with needs, we've already talked about that. So at a level 3, your planned assessments provide evidence that students will use the essential strategy and skills at various points within the learning segment, not just at the end. You've got multiple check-ins for your students. And the assessments really need to provide evidence of how they use both the essential strategy and the related skills. And then, of course, the requirements must be explicitly stated for your IEPs and 504s. You have explicitly met the needs of your students. So I would say this person is checking in with the exit ticket at day 1, the informal rubric on day 2, the formal assessment on day 3. We see the related skills definitely being assessed. The strategy, certainly in the exit ticket, we see the strategy, not too much on the rubric formally, although it's sort of indirectly assessed. It's there, it's not like super strong, but I would feel comfortable saying that this person has met the level 3 criteria. At a level 4, there is an array of assessments. That means multiple kinds of assessments. Not so much in this. We see an exit ticket and we see a rubric that's repeated. So I wouldn't call 2 kinds of assessment an array. We also see evidence that the candidate, that will allow the candidate to determine students. Assessment evidence will allow the candidate to determine students' progress toward developing the strategy and the skills. I think that the evidence is focused heavily on skills because of the way that the rubric was written. We don't see a ton of check-in on the strategy as a whole. And then multiple forms of evidence, not just the same ones. We just talked about that. Providing multiple points of evidence to track the student's progress in skills and strategy. I don't think this person's operating on a level 4. In fact, I feel confident saying they are at a level 3. And my rationale for that is that assessment forms are not varied. The essential literacy strategy is not assessed as much as related skills are. We see a lot of alignment to those skills, not so much to the strategy. Okay. Some reminders of what to look out for. Remember, no modifications will get you a 1. You've got to have direct evidence, and they want you to talk about that. So if you give an exit ticket, what are you expecting to see them get? If you give a rubric, what's the evidence? What score are you going to use to show that they've mastered? Okay, that is it for rubric 5. And come on back for a description of the full rubric walkthrough.